Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks. On this episode, Philip Taubman of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University sat down to talk about his book, In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George Shultz. But the conversation is really a discussion about his observations and the book's observations about the end of the Cold War and looking back at a very unique period in history. With that, on to the show.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's thrilled to be in Austin, a place I've always enjoyed visiting. And now that my mind is focusing to some extent on Robert McNamara, to be here in LBJ territory. So let me start by giving you two sort of milestone points to understand the George Shultz story as Secretary of State. It begins when he came to Washington in 1982. Those of you who remember that period will remember that Alexander Haig was actually the initial Secretary of State. He flamed out after a year, and at that point, Reagan invited Shultz to become secretary. So not long after he gets to Washington, he goes to a dinner party at the home of Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. And I didn't know this story until after the book came out, otherwise it would be in the book. So at that dinner, Bob Woodward from the Post happened to be seated next to Obie Shultz, George's wife. And he turns to her early in the dinner and says, "Mrs. Shultz, what is your husband hoping to accomplish as Secretary of State?" So remember, we're at 1982, at the height of the Cold War. And without missing a beat, she says to Bob, "End the Cold War," which was an astonishing, audacious statement to make at that point. Okay, so you've got to keep that in mind. That's 1982, the summer of 82. And then let's jump ahead for a second, and we get to the years after the Cold War has ended. And here's the way Mikhail Gorbachev summarized George Shultz's contribution to winding down the Cold War. Quote, "Without Reagan, the Cold War would not have ended. But without Shultz, Reagan would not have ended the Cold War." So that tells you accurately that within the years of service as Secretary of State, and I think he was, if not the longest serving, one of the longest serving American Secretaries of State, he played a vital role in winding down the Cold War. Of course, it didn't actually end until the presidency of George H.W. Bush and the secretaryship of Jim Baker. But the curtain was descending by the time Shultz and Reagan exited in January 1989. So how did he do this? How did that happen? So let's go back and I'll fill you in a little bit about his background and some of the characteristics that contributed to his ability to play this vital role as Secretary of State. So you see here the photo of George with his dad in San Francisco. As a kid, they had traveled cross-country on some business that his father had, and they wound up at Kezar Stadium, which turned out to be appropriate because George, late in life, was a big 49er football fan and played football himself in college. Here he is as a player at Princeton. So George ends up at Princeton. In the senior year, he's hoping to be a starting running back, and then he blows out his knee. And the coach says, "Okay, I'm going to make you the coach of the freshman running backs." In those days, unlike today, there was a separation between the freshman team and the rest of the varsity. So George gets this job, and it actually was a moment that he always remembered, and I think did play a role in some of the things that he was able to do as Secretary of State, because it was as the coach for these freshmen that he learned some important lessons about the importance of teamwork. And you'll see later he becomes an important melder of a team, not just within the Reagan administration, but more importantly in some ways with Gorbachev and Gorbachev's foreign minister, Shevardnadze. The other thing he learns as a coach at Princeton is the importance of listening. So George, throughout his career, was remarkable in the patience that he brought to meetings with people and listening to them. A lot of people who get to Washington in senior roles end up talking all the time and not listening very much. George had the capacity to listen. It was something that he began to develop at Princeton. So bear that in mind as we go ahead. The other sidelight from George at Princeton is, and some of you may have heard this over the years, there was always this rumor that George had a tattoo of the Princeton Tiger on his butt. And whenever he was asked about this by reporters or colleagues, he would always be very coy in saying no comment. Well, I have the distinction of having confirmed that this tattoo existed. I was not a witness to it, but in the research I did for the book, I found the letter that his buddy wrote home after he and George went up to New York after Pearl Harbor to try to enlist in the Canadian military. They were so impatient to get to war that they first wanted to enlist in the Canadian military. They got turned down, George's case, because of eyesight. They went and had a few drinks in New York, right? And then they went to a tattoo parlor, and he describes how they had these tattoos. So we know that that was true. Okay. While at Princeton, George did some research for his senior thesis about the Tennessee Valley Authority. Here he is down in Tennessee. And as some of you also may know, it's an interesting requirement at Princeton that I don't think is true at most universities any longer. You have to write a thesis to graduate from Princeton. And so he did his thesis on economic issues associated with the Tennessee Valley Authority and the federal aid that was flowing in to help people in the region. His takeaway from that experience was also very important to him. And that was the importance of learning from experience rather from textbooks or learning from theory. And throughout his life, George was someone who relied very heavily on what he had seen and heard and witnessed, as much, if not more, than what he read in theories as an economist and then as a diplomat. And you'll see this applies, and it was a characteristic that served him very well, among other things, because it was a characteristic shared by Ronald Reagan. And so it was really helpful. So George came away from this experience in Tennessee convinced that you can learn as much by talking to people and listening to them and seeing what's going on as you can from economic textbooks. He finally did enlist in the Marine Corps, and after he graduated, he went to war in the Pacific Theater as a captain commanding an anti-aircraft artillery unit. And they were sent into some combat zones in the South Pacific. He fared better than many Marines who lost their lives in some of the bloodiest engagements in that theater. But he did wind up in some combat situations. And his Marine experience left a lasting legacy with him. Among other things, the drill sergeant who taught him to handle a rifle in boot camp made a huge impression on him. And anyone who knew George the rest of his life is familiar with George's account of this period when the drill sergeant showed him the rifle, showed him how to disassemble it, assemble it, and operate it, and said to him and his fellow young Marine recruits, "Never point this rifle at anyone unless you're prepared to pull the trigger." And that was something he always remembered. And in his mind, Later in life, it translated into the idea, no false threats. If you're playing a role in the command of America's military forces, if you're going to use them, you better be ready to actually use them and not just posture them somewhere in a form of coercive diplomacy, which he was more than willing to do. But it was his feeling, if you put them out there and then you got to use them, you got to pull the trigger. So that was an important thing. And then in combat, of course, this left lessons that were indelible for George. So in one of the islands that they landed on in the South Pacific, the landing was peaceable. In fact, the Japanese forces who had been dug in on the island had evacuated, knowing that the Americans were coming. So they get onto the island, but within a day or two, Japanese air force came into play. And they came to bomb the island and strafe George's Marine unit. And they weren't ready. The equipment wasn't ready. They had set up their anti-aircraft equipment. Some of it wasn't anchored in the ground properly. They were caught by surprise. 8 or 9 of his fellow Marines were killed in that engagement. And the impression that it left on George, he used to sum up very simply, is that he told them to scatter, which was apparently the right decision, because there was a church on the island, or a building, and there was a temptation to run into it, and of course it was blown up by the attacking Japanese aircraft. They scattered. Then he's coming back to the position where he had left the sergeant with whom he relied on, and he comes back and he's not there. And he says to another one of the Marines, "Where's Patton?" The name of the sergeant. Turned out that was a mismemory of a name, but that's the name. He said, "Where's Patton?" "He's dead, sir." So obviously this registered with Shultz, and he soon recognized that 7 or 8 of his fellow Marines had been killed that day. So that, again, is something that you want to keep in mind as he goes forward. Okay, after the war, he's graduated from Princeton. He had been accepted his senior year to go to a PhD program in economics at MIT. He shows up at MIT, and it's an amazing experience for him because it's, right after the war. He's there on the GI Bill of Rights, and he's taking a class. Many of you will know the name Paul Samuelson, one of the most famous American economists of the 20th century. George Shultz ends up in a seminar with one other student and Samuelson. So, what an opportunity for him to have that experience. Although, interestingly, George did not adopt Samuelson's sort of, outlook on the economy, anything but. George became a disciple of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. And I would often ask George, as I was interviewing him for this book, I said, "What happened? Paul Samuelson was ineffective in persuading you about, Keynesian economics." And he said, "Well, I thought it was okay, but then I went to Chicago and I changed my mind." So that's where he became a kind of Friedman economist. So he gets, while he's at MIT, he becomes an assistant professor after he gets his PhD. He spends, I believe it was a year in 1955, his first tour in Washington as a staff member on the Council of Economic Advisors, Eisenhower's president, and he meets a very important mentor at that point in Washington, Arthur Burns, who is the chair of the council at that time. And he and George interact in very important ways later when George becomes Secretary of the Treasury in the Nixon administration, and Burns is the chair of the Federal Reserve. But this is an important moment for him in networking, I guess you would say. He goes back to MIT, and he gets an offer from the University of Chicago to come and be a professor at the University of Chicago Business School. He worries about whether it's the right thing to do. He ends up accepting the job. I should have mentioned here, he is marrying Obi. He met Obi in Honolulu during the war. She was a nurse. They fell in love. They got married. There's a picture on their wedding day. Here he is in a library at the University of Chicago. And George at Chicago advances very quickly, becomes the dean of the business school. And then here's where Arthur Burns reappears. Arthur Burns says to candidate Nixon, former Vice President Nixon, now candidate for president in 68. You got to meet this guy, Shultz. He's really wise about economic issues, especially labor issues. So Nixon brings him in as an advisor during the campaign. Nixon's elected, and at that point, he invites Shultz to become Secretary of Labor. Shultz is at Stanford at this point on sabbatical at the Institute for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, which is a beautiful facility up in the foothills. And from there, you can look out over the Stanford campus and the Bay Area. And again, there's an insightful moment here. George goes to his office at Stanford, and he looks in, those offices at the Institute are very Spartan. And he says to the director, "Where's the telephone?" And the director says, "Oh, we have no telephones up here. There's a telephone in my office. If you need to use the phone, come to my office." And George says, "How can I possibly use the phone, work without a phone?" The director says, "You'll come to like it, okay?" And he did. I'm going to jump ahead for a minute here so you'll see the connection. As Secretary of State, he did something very unusual, which I wish a lot of American secretaries of state would do. Almost every day, he would carve out a half an hour. He would retreat into the little private study of the secretary, and he would tell his assistant who took phone calls, "The only person who you may put through a phone call from is the President of the United States and Obi." And so he used that half hour to think about what he was doing as Secretary of State, which I think, again, is an unusual thing. And I asked him about this. I said, "What was the point of that, George?" He said, "I had to keep the big picture in mind. I had to keep an eye on what I was trying to accomplish, and not just every decision that was coming to me. And every day there were many decisions." He becomes Secretary of Labor. And here's an insight into George, again, and this is the kind of thing that served him well in the Reagan administration. He announces his picks as Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary, Assistant Secretaries of Labor at a news conference. He goes down, he introduces everybody. Guess what? They're either all Democrats or they're all independents. There wasn't a single Republican among the people he brought in to the Labor Department. He goes back to his room at the hotel, and he gets this furious call from one of Nixon's advisors saying, "What the hell are you doing, George? How can you appoint a bunch of Democrats in this administration?" And he said, "I don't care whether they're Republican or Democrat or independent. I'm picking the best people for the job," which he did. So George serves as Secretary of Labor, first Director of the Office of Management and Budget when it was created by Nixon, and Treasury Secretary. When you add those to his service as Secretary of State, you have one of only two men in American history, two people, who have ever held 4 cabinet jobs. The other, by the way, was Elliot Richardson. As Secretary of Labor, we're now going to segue into the Soviet Union in some important ways. He's invited to the Soviet Union. He goes there with an open mind. He understands they're America's adversaries, that their system, political system, economic system is the antithesis of the American system. He understands that the Soviet Union is a police state. But while he's there, he sees things that make a huge impression on him and that he applies as Secretary of State. The most important of which is his host in Moscow is a crusty, Stalinist minister, his counterpart in the Kremlin. The two of them go to Leningrad on a visit. And George says to this minister on the way up, I assume we're going to go to the Hermitage, and, yes, of course, and, we'll see all the sites that are associated with the czars and the Bolshevik Revolution, which began in Leningrad, St. Petersburg at the time. But before we go there, I'm taking you to the cemetery. And he took him to the cemetery in Leningrad, which, if any of you have ever been there, is a very powerful place because it's a site of mass graves and the tens of thousands of Soviet citizens and soldiers who died during the 900-day siege of Leningrad in World War II. They're buried there in mounds of mass graves. And as George is walking down the pathway between these mounds, he realizes that the translator has stopped translating. And he turns to her, and she's weeping. And then he turns to the minister, and the minister is weeping too. And George says to himself, my God, these are people. They're just like us. When we go to a cemetery for fallen soldiers in America, we are honoring their sacrifice, and that's what's happening here. So he goes up onto the terrace that overlooks the cemetery, and he gives a crisp Marine salute, and then he speaks words about how he understands the sacrifice that was made by those people. And that registered two ways. It registered with the Kremlin because they heard he had done this, and it left a big impression on George about the fact that, yeah, there are enemies, there are adversaries. They could wipe us off the face of the earth with a nuclear strike, but they're also people. And let's think of them as people as well as adversaries. Also on this trip, Obi goes to a hospital and she sees the decrepit state of Soviet healthcare. I saw that when I lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years in the 1980s. I mean, it was unbelievable. Operating rooms with multiple operating tables, surgical equipment that wasn't sterilized adequately, a lack of anesthesia. I mean, it was a nightmare. And George witnessed this. And he kind of said to himself, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? I thought this was this rival superpower, but it's actually a 19th century country in many ways with nuclear weapons. So these were very important factors to him. Okay, now let's fast forward. He sticks with Nixon too long, in my view. Watergate is engulfing Nixon, and it turns out that Shultz is the last of the original Nixon cabinet members to resign. He waits until May of '74, 3 months before Nixon resigns. This goes to a sense of loyalty that George had that I think didn't always serve him well. Okay, he comes back out to the West Coast. He sets up shop at Stanford at the business school as a professor. And more importantly, he becomes a senior executive at Bechtel. Reagan is running for president. Like Nixon, he invites Shultz to serve on a campaign advisory panel. He does. Haig is appointed secretary, flames out. Reagan brings him to Washington. The thing that George did not know when he came to Washington was exactly what Ronald Reagan wanted to do in US-Soviet relations. So if you think back to that period, those of us who witnessed it, it seems odd that one didn't know what Reagan wanted to do because he was very public about what he wanted to do, or so it seemed to be. First thing, let's beef up our military, invest tens of billions of dollars in his phrase, rebuilding America's military, which he was well abetted in by Caspar Weinberger, his Secretary of Defense. And by the way, those today, we think of all the division in Congress about almost everything. These huge investments in American military power were approved both by Democrats and Republicans in Congress without a lot of debate, frankly. The other thing he did was this belligerent rhetoric about the Soviet Union. Remember the phrases, the Soviet Union is an evil empire, communism will wind up on the ash heap of history. It was very aggressive anti-Soviet rhetoric. And that's what defined the beginning of his presidency. And then he announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or as people refer to it, Star Wars, with this space-based missile shield that in theory was going to shoot down any Russian missiles or warheads coming towards the United States. Technologically impossible at the time, technologically more viable in some ways now, but the idea of an entire space shield that would shoot down all Soviet or Russian missiles now still technologically beyond our reach. But he bought into it. Shultz disagreed with it, fought it, and then approved it once Reagan did. The one thing that Reagan wasn't doing, and here I think I'm in disagreement with a colleague of yours who I gather is recently moving on to the University of Florida, Will in Bowdoin. And Will wrote a wonderful book, which I read very carefully. And if you read his book next to my book, you'll see two very different depictions of Reagan. In Will's view, Reagan came to Washington knowing exactly what he wanted to do and then executed on it. He wanted to end the Cold War. In my view, he may have come to Washington with that idea in mind, but he had no idea how to execute on the negotiation part of the formula. And it wasn't until Shultz became Secretary of State that he was able to do that. And at the beginning, Shultz couldn't get anywhere with this effort. The turning point, there were a number of them, but the one I think that's best is the blizzard of 1983 in Washington in February. The Reagans can't get up to Camp David for the weekend, so instead they invite the Shultzes to the White House for a private dinner. This was a deliberate, the weather wasn't anything Nancy Reagan could control, but the invitation was a very deliberate effort on her part to put her husband together with a man she believed had his best interests at heart in hoping to end the Cold War. And it was at that dinner that George and Ronald Reagan, for the first time, really understood that they were on the same page. And if you go back and look at the record, there's this wonderful secret diary that was kept by George's executive assistant, Ray Seitz. During the first 2.5, 3 years of his service as Secretary of State, it's 800-page document, single-spaced, which I had exclusive access to for this book. And I would love to talk to Will at some point about this and see, if you read that diary, would you want to modify anything you said in your book? Because the diary, to me, is the unvarnished story of how George Shultz was blocked over and over and over again in his efforts to engage Reagan in discussions about how to wind down the Cold War. And the diary is full of descriptions of George coming back to the office, ready to pull out his hair after he'd been to the White House, out of frustration of, I thought I was going to meet with the president, and I got there, and the room was filled with the president and the Secretary of Defense and the CIA director and the National Security Advisor, all of whom did not want to wind down the Cold War at that point. And so there are quotes in the book. You'll see George actually comes back and says, I desperately need a meeting with the president to talk about US-Soviet relations. I mean, how could that be that the Secretary of State can't get a meeting one-on-one with the president? This begins to change at the dinner at the White House. It didn't change overnight. There were continued to be huge frustrations. And of course, what would have happened if Mikhail Gorbachev had not become Soviet leader? Because during the first term, Reagan is facing Brezhnev, he's facing Andropov, and he's facing Chernenko. They were all elderly men in failing health, unable to conduct any kind of creative diplomacy. And so even if George had succeeded in getting these diplomatic overtures launched with the Kremlin, they could have come to naught, might well have come to naught. But you get to 85, Reagan has just been overwhelmingly reelected, and now you've got Gorbachev as Soviet leader, and he soon brings Shevardnadze in. So we'll go through this quickly. This is the years as labor secretary. Some of you may recognize George Meany in the front row, the labor leader at the time. There's George with Milton Friedman and Nixon. Here he is after he becomes Treasury Secretary. He loved that photo as a Bechtel executive, as a Reagan advisor, and once he becomes Secretary of State. If you want to understand the relationship between Nancy Reagan and George Shultz, that sums it up. She was his benefactor and protector. And in fact, after that White House dinner during the blizzard, 5 months later, his primary opponent in the White House, Judge Clark, Bill Clark, who was the National Security Advisor, is displaced, moves over to become Secretary of the Interior, and Bud McFarlane becomes National Security Advisor. So guess who made that happen? Nancy Reagan. And now we get to the era with Gorbachev. And there are a series of photos here. I'll stop with this one at Reykjavik. So Gorbachev comes in, and for his own reasons, he wants to wind down the Cold War because he realizes that the Soviet Union is essentially a failing state with nuclear weapons. So he's motivated. Shevardnadze is motivated. Reagan and Shultz are motivated. So the series of summit meetings begin in 85 in Geneva, and then in Reykjavik in 86, which is this picture, where they got together in this little house, Hofty house by the sea in Reykjavik, and they were there for 2 days, and they came within a hair of agreeing to eliminate nuclear weapons. End of sentence, period. Eliminate nuclear weapons. It fell apart. Frankly, had they reached that agreement, I don't think it would have survived in Washington or Moscow. But that's how they were thinking at that time. Let's get rid of these weapons before they get rid of us. The whole thing collapsed because Reagan didn't want to agree with the Gorbachev proposal on how to deal with SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And from there, there was another summit in Washington, and then ultimately in 1988, Reagan went to Moscow. And the two things that signaled to me that the Cold War had ended or was about to end was when Gorbachev came to Washington, and tens of thousands of Washingtonians came out on the sidewalks to cheer him as his motorcade went by. It was like John Glenn after his trip into space. Gorbachev was a hero to Americans at that point. It was the most amazing thing to see. And then I happened to be in Moscow at the time that Reagan came to Moscow. And he's out in Red Square. And to me, it was the most striking image of the end of the Cold War. Reagan standing next to Gorbachev in Red Square. Behind them is, the St. Basil's Cathedral and the walls of the Kremlin. And standing about as far away from me as that desk is the American serviceman with the nuclear codes, the football as they call it, so that the president can launch nuclear weapons in an instant wherever he or she is. He's standing there with the codes right there, which if he chose to use them at that point, he would have committed suicide, among other things. And the American reporter, Sam Donaldson, this obstreperous ABC correspondent who loved to shout out questions, says, "Mr. President, do you still think it's the evil empire?" And Reagan looks at him and says, "No, sir, that was another time and another place." So I knew at that moment that the curtain was really coming down on the Cold War. So when you look back at this period with Shultz, you see that what was so effective about his service as Secretary of State, he knew how to build a relationship with Shevardnadze and Gorbachev. He knew, most importantly, how to build a relationship with Ronald Reagan once the two of them began to have a chance to confer. Thanks to Nancy, some of his opposition within the administration was moved out of the way. He was patient, he was persistent, he was creative and determined in his diplomacy. When you look back at the record, you see literally hundreds of hours of negotiating in the trenches with Shevardnadze on various things that essentially took the tension out of the Cold War. So, when you look back on Shultz, the takeaway to me, and I wish I saw people like George Shultz in Washington today. I don't see many of them. You see a man who was non-ideological, who was a problem solver, who believed in common sense, who was disdainful of histrionics, who went to work every day trying to solve a problem. The problem was called the Cold War. That's what he did every day. And in today's Washington, you don't get the feeling that there are people like that around anymore, which is a pity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.